So throughout my time making these videos, a lot of people have asked me, why don't I cover more popular artists? Why don't I tell the stories of Lil Uzi, XXXTentacion, Drake, people like that? And it's not that I'm completely against that, but oftentimes I find those stories of the true underground a lot more interesting. I mean, everybody likes a good rags to riches story of somebody who came from poverty, made their way up in the rap game, got some popular songs and got a bunch of money and started living life the way they always wanted to. But at the same time, the people who don't make it, or the people who get there in a lot weirder ways and don't make it to that big time status, are often more interesting to me. And I'm going to prove that point today by talking about a cult rapper. And no, I don't mean a rapper with a cult fan base. I'm talking about a rapper that actually ran a cult during the time that he was making music. And that artist's name is Bloody Ruckus. So strap in. It's going to be a little bit of a dark one today, but let's get right into it when we talk about Preston Hyde, also known as Bloody Ruckus. Preston was born March 27, 1993 in Green Bay, Wisconsin, to a native mother and a German father. And although his parents were together when he was growing up, his childhood was anything but happy. Because not only did he grow up in a dangerous neighborhood that was also very poor, his home life wasn't any better because his parents were both very abusive, often beating him, and when they weren't beating him, they were locking him in the basement for 24 hours to sometimes even 48 hours with no water or food. All this time locked in the basement would lead him to have very dark thoughts, thinking about death, even though he didn't really know what it was at the time. But after one of his family members passed away, he fully understood what it was and became almost obsessed with it. And this would really shape his taste in music, often listening to Memphis funk, horrorcore, and death metal. Basically any type of music that sounded dark and dabbled in weird themes that he was fascinated with. His biggest inspirations were 3 6 Mafia, Evil Pimp, Shy One, and Dosia Demon. They would inspire him to start making his own music by writing poetry about how he felt. Unfortunately, there was no way that he could record anything though, because he didn't have the means, the money, or even the knowledge to really do so. And if you think his school life was any better, it wasn't, because he ended up getting heavily bullied by all of his fellow classmates, and because of that, he would eventually write a poem about how he wanted to shoot up his school, which only got him in more trouble with the law and at home. Which of course only led to more beatings and more long nights locked in the basement writing down violent lyrics. So you would think his entire life would be a living hell, but he did have one escape from it, and that was when he was hanging out with his friends slash gang, the Spanish Vice Lords. Which I know is a crazy statement to say that his only escape was hanging out with a gang, because of course they were doing a lot of violent actions, he was getting into a lot of trouble with them, but that was basically the only time he got to be who he wanted to be and wasn't locked up or getting bullied or harassed or just overall being treated like he was subhuman. But as I previously stated, there was a lot of downsides to it too, because he ended up getting into violent altercations with rival gang members all the time, getting arrested over 20 times throughout his youth. And this landed him in juvie over and over again, so if he wasn't confined at home, he was confined in juvie, and one of these situations that occurred while he was in juvie is actually where his name came from, because he ended up beating up somebody so bad that one of the officers called it a bloody ruckus, and after that, that was his rap name. I'm sure you can only imagine how violent something called a bloody ruckus would be, but it is a pretty dope rap name, so at least something good came out of the situation. I'm sorry guys, I'm trying to put a little bit of levity into this video, but overall it's just a very dark tale from start to end, so the jokes are definitely going to be lesser than the usual videos, okay? Okay, let's get back to it. So when Bloody wasn't locked up in juvie, a mental hospital, or his parents' basement, he actually ended up going over to his cousin's house and recording music for the first time. Around the age of 15, his cousin Big L, not to be confused with the famous Big L and Killa Kelvin, first showed him how to record and mix his own vocals. And this finally gave him a non-violent outlet to be able to express himself, really talk about everything he was going through, and he fell in love with it right away. But unfortunately, this wasn't the most peaceful place to record music, because after all, his cousins were gang affiliated, he was gang affiliated, there was a lot of gang members coming in and out recording music, not really doing any illegal activity, but when you see a bunch of gang members all in one place, the cops decided to break down the door and do illegal raids almost every week. Not to mention the power would often turn off, so they had to get an outside generator that was gas powered just so they could get a couple hours recording music. Which is kind of crazy to me, because for example, it takes me about an hour to record audio for just these videos. I'm not even making music, and he was able to do it in a place that was constantly being raided and the power was going off, showing just how dedicated he was to making music from an early age. During the time that he was recording music at this studio, he ended up doing 2 mixtapes, one called Coming Out of the Woods, which unfortunately I can't seem to find. I think it was only printed on mixtape and seems to be completely lost at this point. We're not even really sure when it dropped. And Nightmare on the Res Part 1, The Rage, which came out sometime during 2010, also printed on a mixtape I believe, but it also surfaced online a couple years later. But Bloody wouldn't stick with this outdated format for very long, because he was a pretty early adopter of the internet music wave, posting tracks on both SoundClick, not even SoundCloud because it wasn't around yet, and YouTube. And then he would share the links to these projects on horrorcore forums, building up somewhat of a cult fan base online. Because after all, this was the early 2010s, so music was changing quite a bit. The early 90s type of rap that was more dark and boom bap like and had a lot more lyrical substance to it was falling out of favor, and the more poppy acts like Drake and Tyga were coming into the mainstream, which created kind of a weird effect where horrorcore definitely wasn't very popular, but the people who were actually actively seeking it out online were definitely super into it, so you would have less fans listening to your music, but the ones who would be listening to it would be very dedicated. Unfortunately though, most of his fan base base was online, and people in his actual neighborhood definitely weren't rocking with the style of music he was making. People would try to convince him to make a more mainstream type of music, even his own cousins were trying to convince him to do so, but he knew that he only wanted to make horrorcore. That was the only type of music that really spoke to him, and if he was going to have a career in music, it needed to be his own way. So he ended up falling out with them and never used their studio to record again. And that stubborn attitude definitely hurt him in the short term because he didn't have a consistent place to record music anymore. He wasn't really getting booked for shows, and when he was, there was only about 5 to 10 people in the audience, and they weren't really rocking with what he was doing, so it seemed like doing music full time was becoming more and more of a pipe dream by the day. But lucky for him, there was a growing brand within the Geneva area known as Wicked Wisconsin, which was booking shows for people like Insane Clown Posse, Twisted, and 3-6 Mafia. And he just so happened to get scouted at one of his own shows by an artist known as Mo Folly, who booked him to play with Wicked Wisconsin. It went really well, and just like that, he was playing all over the country with big time horrorcore acts like the aforementioned Insane Clown Posse, Twisted Insane, and even Tech 9. And Bloody would quickly gain a reputation as a performer because he was absolutely insane, cutting his face open, throwing chairs at the audience, beating himself up with a microphone, covering himself in blood in more ways than one. You would think that people would absolutely hate this, but it turns out that people actually wanted to show up to see this go down. Yeah, those horrorcore shows are definitely different than anything I've ever been to, but hey, what the people want is what the people want. And the ways that he would promote his shows were even more chaotic. He'd get 30 of his friends to run into homeless shelters, schools, churches, Planned Parenthood, hospitals, basically anywhere they could, and just yell about how he was going to have a show and that everybody should show up. And surprisingly, that actually worked. Which makes me ask the question, what's wrong with all these new upcoming artists always complaining about how they can't get promo or it's too much money to get on a playlist? Screw the playlist. Go out with 30 of your homies, run into a church, and tell everybody you have a new song coming out and everybody should listen to it. Trust me, it will definitely work. That's a joke, by the way. Please don't run into a church and commit a crime and then say Twisted World convinced you to do so. Thank you. Anyways, back to the story. So at this point, you would think that everything would be going in a good direction for Bloody Ruckus. He was getting more attention online, he was getting booked at bigger and bigger shows, he was even getting to meet some of his all-time heroes, but his home life still wasn't good. He had already been pretty well homeless for years at this point, having run away from his parents' house around the age of 15, living from couch to couch, but he ended up getting a girl pregnant around the age of 18, and now that he had her to look after as well, he really had nowhere else to go. They ended up sleeping outside most nights, sometimes at public parks, sometimes on benches, sometimes under bridges, and the only time they really got a warm place to stay was when they broke into an abandoned house and lit a fire, or if they were lucky, when he was recording music at the studio, sometimes people would let them stay the night just to have a place to sleep. And around the same time, he ended up recording and dropping his mixtape called Dark and Cold, which many of his fans considered his best work to date because it was so raw and real to what was really going on in his life. It was dark, and people had never heard anything like it before. Luckily for him though, these times wouldn't last forever, and his homie Bob Elrich would let him move in with him. Unfortunately though, his baby mother didn't come along, and after that, he sunk into the deepest depression he had ever felt in his life. And on top of that, in 2013, he would have more legal troubles when he ended up in the middle of a gang dispute where he beat a rival gang member half to death and then caught a felony battery charge, which he ended up fighting for the coming months. During the time that he was fighting this charge, he actually got noticed by a record company called Lyrical Snuff Productions, who had just made a new spin-off company called Jonestown Records, which ended up signing him. If you couldn't tell, this record company was heavily influenced by cults, being named after the place that the infamous cult leader Jim Jones ended up taking hundreds of his followers to eventually meet their end when they ended up drinking Kool-Aid with cyanide in it. It's an absolutely insane story that I probably can't talk that much about on YouTube because it involves a lot of violence and not so safe for work type stuff. So getting back to Jonestown Records, it turns out that Bloody was taking the cult influence a little too far, starting to call his fans his actual followers and taking 20 of his most devoted followers onto a compound in the woods where they would all stay together. Luckily, this didn't end up becoming a Charles Manson situation where a bunch of people ended up killing a bunch of other people, but some of the followers would break into grocery stores, rob drug dealers at gunpoint, and that started to get Bloody in trouble with the law once again. With one member in particular getting so high on drugs that he ended up breaking into a gas station trying to rob the place at gunpoint, and after the cops caught him, he told them that he was actually there because the god Bloody Ruckus had told him to go and be a martyr for his people, apocalypse, something something. Anyways, Bloody Ruckus ended up getting placed on 24/7 surveillance after that point, and things got even worse. This made it so he'd have to leave through the window, jump over a couple houses, and go through a back alley just to get away from the police and not be followed, and even worse than that, Jonestown Records ended up going out of business not too long after that. But luckily for him, even with his record company going out of business, he ended up releasing Dark and Cold on cassette tape, and his followers absolutely ate it up. Not to mention other people in the area also gave it a listen because he was gaining a reputation as a musical cult leader, and most people just wanted to see what type of music that type of person would make. On the other side of things though, he ended up getting arrested again, spending 4 months in prison during the latter half of 2013. When he was released in 2014, he ended up getting placed on a 3-year probation, and then he started working with Wicked Blue and another artist called Gino of the Dark Half. Okay, so just a bit of a correction here. When I speak about Gino, he was actually part of a group called Dark Half, so that's why I said of the dark half, but his real name is Gino Cult Shit, and when I talk about Damian Quinn later on, he's also part of that group. It's not Damian Dark, it's Damian Quinn from Dark Half, who was the previous owner of Jonestown Records before it went defunct. Him and Wicked Blue ended up working on a project called Planned Parenthood, which I'm not touching with the 10-foot pole, as well as moving in Gino of the Dark Half into their place because his drug addiction was growing so bad that they were worried that he might pass away. At this point it was May 2015 and Bloody was working on his next project, My Bloody Valentine, shooting music videos, doing visuals, and apparently Gino got clean enough that he was able to move back into his own place, but they still kind of worried that he might relapse. They tried their best to convince him to stay because they knew if he went back to that same old neighborhood, he'd fall back into the same patterns and be no better off than he was in the first place. But unfortunately, he wouldn't listen, and soon after that, Bloody would hear the news at one of his shows that Gino had passed away alongside his baby mother, who was actually pregnant at the time. This would put Bloody into one of the worst mental spaces he had ever been in his entire life, when his friend Wicked Blue would also get into a car accident and pass away on the way to Gino's funeral, no less. This made it feel like the entire scene was cursed, and many fans would start to step away, not being able to take all the heartache and loss that was going on. The rest of 2015 was definitely pretty rough for him, but once 2016 rolled around, he was able to get more opportunities to perform alongside ICP once again, as well as Twisted. Getting a cosign from the two biggest horrorcore acts in the world at the time definitely helped him to get bigger and bigger shows, and he would eventually get booked on at Gorefest. He ended up performing alongside two artists named Saw the Ghost as well as Damian Dark, and his performance was so good that he ended up landing the front cover of Horrorcore magazine, which is basically the equivalent of being an XXL freshman back in 2016, you know, when it used to matter. And after that, things got even better because he would land another record deal with Lyrical Snuff Productions, which if you remember is actually the parent company of Jonestown Records, so it was familiar people, and it seems like things were finally going in a good direction for him, but nobody could have seen what was coming next. Because an event would take place that ended up shaking the entire scene as well as making worldwide news when Bloody ended up being part of a cannibalistic ritual where he drank a woman's blood. Or at least that's what the news media was saying, but the actual story is nowhere near as vile. Apparently they were hanging out with this woman who was really into body modifications. She wanted to cut her finger off and replace it with a metal cap, and I guess Bloody and his friend decided to do that for her, with his friend cutting off her finger and Bloody filming the entire situation. And don't get me wrong, that's pretty weird and macabre, but once the police and the Rolling Stones picked up this story, they ended up blowing it way out of proportions. They were trying to give Bloody over 100 years in prison just for filming somebody else cut a girl's finger off. The court attempted to hit him with 3 charges that if he was convicted of would equal up to 150 years in prison: kidnapping, reckless injury, and second-degree mayhem. And this entire case was basically built off the back of him being a priorly convicted felon, as well as the persona that he had as a cult leader, and because of that, the prosecution wasn't even trying to show the jury the actual video of the girl getting her finger cut off, and he was basically forced to sit in prison during the time that he was fighting this case. Eventually the video would surface and the kidnapping charge was dropped, taking 100 years off his sentence, but he was still fighting 52 years in prison. He was able to be released on bail in mid-2017, with him immediately dropping Bloody Valentine as well as working on his next project, because in his mind he thought he was going to go to prison for the rest of his life and wanted to drop one more body of music before he finally went away. But if you were to give this entire case one positive spin, it's the fact that all the news coverage would gain him new eyes on his music, not to mention all the old fans were still pulling through for him, sending him a bunch of letters in prison telling him that he would beat the case and make it out the other side. But he was losing hope pretty quick. He didn't see any way that he was going to be able to beat all of that time in prison and knew that his life would soon be over, so he was ready to go out on his own terms. And as soon as he was able to speak freely about the case, he would attempt to prove his innocence by taking as many interviews as he could, and the second thing he was trying to do was promote his final 2 projects, Population 909, made to be a collaboration project with the label known as Cult Activity, and his final solo project known as Funeral Macabre, meant to be his final words before he went to prison for the rest of his life, or what he actually planned to do was, and this was meant to serve as kind of a type of note. I'm pretty sure you all know what I'm saying, but I'm not allowed to say that word on YouTube, so let's move on. He ended up finishing Funeral Macabre one day before he was set to go to trial. It wasn't mixed or mastered, but he gave it to his friends and left it in their hands to be released after his final day of judgment was met. And on that fateful day in court, when it seemed like he was going to be locked up for the rest of his life, either the judge or the jury or somebody took mercy on him, because they actually ended up dismissing the mayhem charge and he was only hit with the reckless injury charge, giving him 1 year in prison. And even better than that, he already had some time served, so he only really had to sit in prison for about 6 months time. But there was one downside to this trial. The judge wasn't going to allow him to perform live music anymore, because he was now seen as a danger to the community and his influence would make other people commit violent acts. So on the one hand, he earned his freedom back, but on the other hand, he was no longer going to be able to make a full-time living off of making music, so he decided to walk away from it once and for all. But that wasn't actually the end, because he never really walked away from music. All he did was start covering up his face when he went to performances. He knew if he got caught he would go back to prison, but he didn't care. He wanted to see his fans, he wanted to make music, and this is all he ever really loved and the only thing that ever really made him feel whole. Not to mention all the fans that he had built up during his time making music. He knew there was no way he would ever be able to walk away from them and leave them in the dark, so he kept performing, knowing very well that he could get in trouble, but surprisingly, that's not what actually got him caught up. It was instead a music video where he was seen holding a gun. And that was seen as a parole violation. On top of that, there was somebody who was claiming that Bloody tried to extort him out of money. So just a little bit of an adjustment when it comes to the extortion charge. Basically what they said happened was that him and his gang decided to jump somebody and try to extort them out of a couple $1,000s, but that's what's documented. We don't know if it actually really happened, but I wanted to make that clear that it wasn't just him who extorted the person. So he was sent back to prison for 3 long years. And during this time, he saw the absolute worst of humanity. Friends left him behind, his buzz in the music industry ended up fading away. He was basically losing everything he ever had just by sitting in prison for all that time. And even worse than being locked up, he would also have family issues with his kids not being allowed to see him anymore and his father passing away from cancer. But even with all this going on in his life, he was still able to get on the jail phone, talk to producers, and finally release Funeral Macabre in the way that he wanted to see it done, with the fans absolutely going crazy over it and hoping that he would be free soon. But he ended up sitting in prison for 3 long years until 2022 when he was finally released, but as you probably can already guess, he ended up going back to prison one final time on his birthday, no less. And this is honestly for the dumbest reason you could ever imagine. Apparently on his birthday, his friends decided to make him a cake with frosting that had gravestones on it, and on the gravestones were the names of a couple people that he had beef with. And even though he didn't make the cake, apparently this was seen as him trying to threaten a couple people, so he ended up going back to prison once again for 6 more months because somebody decided to snitch on him. And when he finally got out for the last time, he dropped his track Stop Glorifying Rats, which a lot of his fans loved, but at this point, as you already know, 3 to 4 years in prison is definitely very detrimental to a rap career. His fans are definitely still behind him, but at this point a lot of people have forgotten about him or moved on from that type of genre, so he's definitely struggling a little bit musically. But despite that, he's never stopped. He's managed to land a couple tracks on Trash AMV, he's working on a new album that should release sometime in 2024, and overall this man just loves music so much that he'll never stop making it. And that can be proven by the fact that he's put his life on the line over and over again to keep creating music and doing what he loves. And honestly, even though I know a lot of people are probably going to look down on him for being a cult leader and getting into all this dark ritualistic stuff, but I mean honestly, looking over his entire life, can you really blame him for turning out the way that he did? I mean, his parents were terrible to him, he was surrounded by nothing but poverty and danger and death, and honestly I feel like he turned out pretty well considering. I mean, I'm not trying to stand on a soapbox here, but he grew up a certain way, he had no control over the way that went, and unfortunately nobody ever tried to get him out of that situation. He ended up getting in trouble with the law, and then after that he ended up going back to prison over and over and over again, because once you get in trouble once, it seems like they don't want to help you out, they just want to put you in prison for the rest of your life. So I mean, you can take what you want from that, but either way, shout out Bloody Ruckus. He's still making music now, so if you want to check it out, you definitely can. It's more of that funk style. He also has some kind of screaming stuff, which is pretty cool. Check him out on Trash AMV or his personal channel. Shout out to Knife Gang, and if you like this video, make sure to subscribe because I'm trying to get to 14K. We're almost there. We might make it. I don't know. But either way, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.